Thomas Mitchell had been protecting members of the royal family for 15 years. His weathered hands gripped the steering wheel of the black Range Rover as he navigated through the busy London streets toward Kensington Palace. At 52 years old, he had seen 3 generations of royals grow up before his eyes, but none had captured his attention quite like Prince George. The young prince, now 12 years old, sat quietly in the back seat, his school uniform pristine despite the long day at Lambrook School. Thomas glanced in the rearview mirror and noticed something different about the boy today. There was a tension in George's shoulders that hadn't been there that morning, and his usually bright blue eyes seemed distant and troubled. "Everything all right back there, Your Royal Highness?" Thomas asked, using the formal address that protocol demanded, though his voice carried the warmth of someone who genuinely cared. George looked up from his phone, where he had been scrolling through what appeared to be news articles. "Thomas, do you ever wonder what it would be like to have a normal job? One where you could go home at the end of the day and just be yourself?" The question caught Thomas off guard. In all his years of service, no member of the royal family had ever asked him something so personal, so introspective. He had always maintained the proper distance that his position required, but something in the young prince's voice made him pause. "I suppose I've never really thought about it, sir. This has been my life for so long. I'm not sure I'd know what normal looks like anymore," Thomas replied honestly, pulling up to a red light. George leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Sometimes I look at the other kids at school and I wonder what it would be like to just go home to a regular house, with regular parents who have regular jobs. Do you think that makes me ungrateful?" Thomas felt his heart skip a beat. He had watched this boy grow from a toddler who waved enthusiastically at crowds to a thoughtful young man who was beginning to understand the weight of his destiny. The innocence in the question revealed just how much George had been thinking about his future, about the life that had been chosen for him before he was even born. "Your Highness, I think it makes you human," Thomas said carefully, knowing that this conversation was treading into territory that his training had never prepared him for. The light turned green, and they continued their journey through the historic streets of London. Thomas had driven this route thousands of times, but today it felt different. The usual landmarks seemed to blur together as his mind focused on the young man in the back seat, who was grappling with questions that most 12-year-olds never had to consider. As they approached the palace gates, George spoke again. "Thomas, can I ask you something? And can you promise to give me an honest answer?" Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. Something in the prince's tone suggested that this wasn't going to be an ordinary question. "Of course, sir. I'll always be honest with you. Do you think I have a choice? About my future, I mean. Do you think I could ever choose something different?" The question hung in the air like a heavy fog. Thomas had spent his entire career following orders, protecting the royal family without question, maintaining the traditions and protocols that had been in place for centuries. But now, faced with this young man's earnest question, he found himself questioning everything he had always taken for granted. Thomas pulled through the palace gates and parked in his usual spot. He turned around to face George directly, something he had never done in such an informal way before. The boy's eyes were filled with a mixture of hope and desperation that made Thomas's chest tighten with emotion. "Your Highness," Thomas began, choosing his words carefully. "I think you're asking me a question that I'm not qualified to answer. But what I can tell you is that every person, regardless of their circumstances, deserves to have their voice heard and their feelings considered." George nodded slowly, as if processing this information. "But what if the choices I want to make aren't the ones that everyone expects? What if I want something completely different?" Thomas saw something in the young prince's eyes that he had never seen before, a quiet determination that seemed far beyond his 12 years. It was the look of someone who had already begun to make decisions, even if he hadn't yet spoken them aloud. "Then I suppose you'll have to decide how important those choices are to you," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. George smiled for the first time that day, but it wasn't the carefree smile of childhood. It was the smile of someone who had found confirmation for thoughts he had been carrying alone for too long. As they sat in the parked car, both of them seemed reluctant to end this conversation and return to the world of protocol and duty that waited beyond the car doors. Thomas realized that something fundamental had shifted between them in the space of a 20-minute car ride. "Thank you, Thomas," George said, his hand on the door handle, "for being honest with me. I know it's not easy to answer questions like that. Thomas watched as the young prince walked toward the palace entrance, his shoulders somehow straighter than they had been that morning. As George disappeared through the ornate doors, Thomas remained in the driver's seat, staring at the building that had been the center of his professional life for so many years. For the first time in his career, Thomas Mitchell began to question not just his role as a royal protection officer, but the entire system he had spent his life defending. The innocent questions of a 12-year-old boy had somehow managed to shake the foundation of everything he thought he knew about duty, service, and the right of individuals to choose their own paths. He had no way of knowing that this conversation would be the beginning of a chain of events that would ultimately force him to make the most difficult decision of his professional life. All he knew was that something had changed, and there would be no going back to the way things were before. 3 weeks had passed since that conversation in the car, and Thomas noticed that Prince George had become increasingly withdrawn. The boy who once chatted enthusiastically about his school projects and football matches now sat in thoughtful silence during their daily journeys. Thomas found himself watching George more carefully, not just for security threats, but out of genuine concern for the young man's well-being. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when Thomas received an unusual request. Instead of the normal pickup from Lambrook School, he was instructed to collect Prince George from the palace and take him to a private meeting with his father, Prince William. The location was not the usual formal meeting room, but a small coffee shop in Windsor that the family sometimes used for more casual encounters. As they drove through the countryside, George was even quieter than usual. Thomas could see him in the rearview mirror, staring out the window at the passing fields and villages. His hands were clasped tightly in his lap, and Thomas noticed the slight tremor that suggested nervousness or anxiety. "Big meeting today?" Thomas asked gently, trying to break the silence without overstepping his boundaries. George looked up, startled as if he had forgotten he wasn't alone in the car. "I suppose you could say that," he replied, his voice carrying a weight that seemed far too heavy for someone his age. "Thomas, do you remember what we talked about a few weeks ago? About choices?" Thomas felt his pulse quicken. He had thought about that conversation countless times since it happened, and each time it left him feeling unsettled. "I remember, Your Highness. I've been thinking about it a lot," George continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "And I've realized that I can't keep pretending that I don't have thoughts of my own about what I want my life to look like." Thomas pulled the car over to the side of the road, something he had never done during an official journey unless it was an emergency. But somehow this felt like an emergency of a different kind. He turned around to face George directly. "Sir, can I ask what you're planning to say to your father?" George met Thomas's eyes with a directness that was both impressive and heartbreaking. "I'm going to tell him that I've been thinking about what it would mean to step back from the line of succession. Not now, obviously, but when I'm older, when I can make that choice legally." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. In all his years of service, he had never heard a member of the royal family speak so directly about abandoning their duties. The implications of what George was suggesting were enormous, not just for the boy himself, but for the entire institution of the monarchy. "Your Highness," Thomas said carefully, "that's a very serious thing to consider. Have you thought about what that would mean? For your family, for the country?" George's expression didn't waver. "I've thought about almost nothing else for months, Thomas. Do you know what it's like to be 12 years old and already know exactly what every day of the rest of your life is supposed to look like? To know that people are already making plans for when I become king, when I haven't even figured out who I am as a person yet?" Thomas felt something breaking inside his chest. He had spent his entire career protecting the royal family, but he had never really considered the emotional cost of the life they were born into. Looking at George now, he saw not a future king, but a young man who was drowning under the weight of expectations he had never chosen. "What if they don't understand?" Thomas asked quietly. "Then I suppose I'll have to find a way to make them understand," George replied with a determination that was both admirable and terrifying. They sat in silence for several minutes, both of them aware that they had crossed into territory that neither of them was prepared for. Thomas realized that his role was changing from protector to confidant, and he wasn't sure he was qualified for either position anymore. When they arrived at the coffee shop, Thomas watched as Prince George walked toward the entrance where his father was waiting. Prince William looked relaxed and casual, clearly expecting a routine father-son conversation. Thomas knew that what was about to happen would be anything but routine. As George disappeared inside the small cafe, Thomas remained in the car, his mind racing with the implications of what he had just learned. For the first time in his career, he found himself questioning whether his loyalty should be to the institution he served or to the individual he protected. Through the window of the coffee shop, Thomas could see the two figures seated at a corner table. At first, the conversation appeared normal, a father and son sharing a casual afternoon together. But gradually, Thomas noticed changes in their body language. Prince William's relaxed posture became more rigid, his expression more serious. 20 minutes into the meeting, Thomas saw Prince William's face change completely. The casual smile disappeared, replaced by a look of shock and disbelief. George, meanwhile, sat straighter in his chair, his hands folded calmly on the table as he continued to speak. Thomas found himself leaning forward in his seat, wishing he could hear what was being said. He watched as Prince William ran his hands through his hair, a gesture Thomas recognized as a sign of stress. The prince looked around the cafe as if seeking an escape route, then leaned closer to his son, speaking in what appeared to be urgent whispers. The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, with both father and son appearing increasingly animated. At one point, Prince William stood up from the table, paced to the window, and stared out at the car where Thomas sat waiting. For a moment, their eyes met, and Thomas saw something in the prince's expression that made his stomach drop. It was the look of a man who had just received news that would change everything. When the meeting finally ended, Thomas watched as father and son walked toward the cafe entrance. Prince William's arm was around George's shoulders, but the gesture seemed more protective than affectionate. As they approached the car, Thomas could see that both of them had been crying. George climbed into the back seat without a word, while Prince William approached Thomas's window. The prince's face was pale, and his usual composed demeanor had been replaced by something that looked like barely controlled panic. "Thomas," Prince William said, his voice hoarse, "I need you to take George back to the palace. And I need you to understand that everything you may have heard or observed today must remain completely confidential." Thomas nodded, but he could see in Prince William's eyes that the man knew his son had already shared his thoughts with his protection officer. There was no accusation in the prince's gaze, only a kind of desperate pleading. As they drove back to the palace, George remained silent, staring out the window with the same contemplative expression he had worn on the journey there. But something had changed. The nervousness was gone, replaced by a calm resolve that Thomas found both impressive and deeply troubling. Thomas realized that he had just witnessed the moment when everything began to change, not just for Prince George, but for everyone whose life was connected to the royal family. The young man in his back seat had just set in motion events that would force everyone around him to confront difficult questions about duty, choice, and the price of tradition. The atmosphere at Kensington Palace had changed dramatically in the days following George's meeting with his father. Thomas noticed it immediately. There were more hushed conversations in hallways, more closed-door meetings, and a tension that seemed to permeate every corner of the building. Staff members who had worked together for years suddenly seemed to be watching each other more carefully, as if everyone was waiting for something significant to happen. Thomas was completing his morning security briefing when he was summoned to meet with Commander Sarah Richardson, the head of Royal Protection. Her office was a sterile, efficient space filled with monitors showing various security feeds from around the palace grounds. Sarah was a woman in her late 40s who had risen through the ranks of Scotland Yard before taking on her current role. She was known for her directness and her unwavering dedication to protocol. "Thomas, please have a seat," Sarah said, not looking up from a file she was reviewing. "I need to discuss some concerns that have been raised about your recent interactions with Prince George." Thomas felt his heart rate increase, but he kept his expression neutral. "What kind of concerns, ma'am?" Sarah finally looked up, her gray eyes studying Thomas's face carefully. "It's come to our attention that you may have been engaging in conversations with His Royal Highness that go beyond the scope of your professional duties. Conversations about personal matters and, shall we say, sensitive topics regarding his future role." The words hung in the air between them. Thomas realized that someone had reported his conversations with George, though he couldn't imagine who. The only people who knew about their discussions were George himself and, presumably, Prince William. I've always maintained appropriate boundaries with all members of the royal family, Thomas said carefully. If His Royal Highness chooses to share his thoughts during our journeys, I listen respectfully as part of ensuring his comfort and security. Sarah leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. Thomas, you've been with us for 15 years. Your record is exemplary and you're trusted by the family. But I need to be clear about something. Your role is to protect Prince George, not to counsel him or encourage him in any personal decisions he might be considering. Thomas felt a flash of anger that he worked hard to suppress. With respect, ma'am, I've never encouraged Prince George in anything. I've simply answered his questions honestly when he's asked them. And therein lies the problem, Sarah replied, opening the file in front of her. According to this report, Prince George has been asking questions about having choices regarding his future, about the possibility of stepping away from royal duties. These are not appropriate topics for discussion with security personnel. Thomas stared at Sarah, trying to process what he was hearing. Are you suggesting that I should lie to a 12-year-old boy when he asks me direct questions? I'm suggesting that you should redirect such conversations to more appropriate topics and inform his parents when he raises concerns that are beyond your purview, Sarah said firmly. The royal family has protocols for handling these kinds of situations, and those protocols don't involve discussions with protection officers. Thomas felt something shift inside him, a growing realization that he was being asked to choose between his professional obligations and what he believed was right for the young man he had been protecting for years. So, I ask, who filed this report? Thomas asked. Sarah closed the file. That's not relevant to this discussion. What is relevant is that you understand your role going forward. You are to limit your interactions with Prince George to matters directly related to his security and transportation. Personal conversations are to be discouraged. Thomas left Sarah's office feeling like he had been punched in the stomach. As he walked through the palace corridors, he found himself looking at the portraits of previous monarchs with new eyes. These were people who had been born into roles they never chose, just like George. But how many of them had ever been given the opportunity to voice their doubts or concerns? That afternoon, as Thomas waited outside Lambrook School for George's dismissal, he found himself dreading the car ride back to the palace. How was he supposed to maintain the warm, protective relationship he had always had with the young prince, while following orders to shut down any meaningful conversation? George emerged from the school building looking tired and distracted. He climbed into the car and immediately sensed that something was different. You're quiet today, Thomas, George observed as they pulled away from the school. Thomas glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the young prince watching him with the perceptive eyes that had always impressed him. Just focusing on the road, Your Royal Highness, George frowned. You haven't called me Your Royal Highness that formally in years. What's wrong? Thomas felt his resolve wavering. The boy's genuine concern for his well-being made it even harder to maintain the professional distance he had been ordered to keep. Nothing's wrong, sir. Just following proper protocol. George was quiet for several minutes, but Thomas could see him thinking in the rearview mirror. Finally, the young prince spoke again. Someone told them about our conversations, didn't they? Thomas's hands tightened on the steering wheel. The directness of the question caught him off guard, though he should have expected it. George had always been remarkably perceptive for his age. I don't know what you mean, sir. George leaned forward in his seat. Thomas, please don't lie to me. I can see that something has changed. You're different today, more distant, and you're being formal with me in a way that you haven't been in years. Someone reported our conversations, and now you've been told not to talk to me about anything personal. Thomas pulled the car over to the side of the road, just as he had done several weeks earlier. But this time, when he turned around to face George, he saw something in the young man's eyes that broke his heart. It was disappointment not in the situation, but in Thomas himself. Yes, Thomas said quietly. I've been instructed to limit our conversations to matters directly related to your security. George nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had already suspected. I understand. They're trying to control who I talk to and what I'm allowed to discuss. I suppose I shouldn't be surprised. Thomas watched as George sat back in his seat, his expression becoming more closed off than Thomas had ever seen it. The open, trusting young man who had shared his deepest concerns was disappearing before Thomas's eyes, replaced by someone who was learning to guard his thoughts and feelings. George, Thomas said, using the prince's name without any formal title for the first time in their relationship. "I want you to know that I believe you have the right to ask questions and to think about your future. That hasn't changed, regardless of what I've been told." George looked up, and for a moment the barriers he had been constructing seemed to fall away. "Thank you, Thomas. That means more to me than you know." As they continued their journey to the palace, both of them understood that something fundamental had shifted in their relationship. Thomas realized that he was being forced to choose between following orders and doing what he believed was right for the young man he had come to care about deeply. The conversation with Commander Richardson had made one thing crystal clear: the royal establishment was not prepared to allow Prince George the freedom to explore his doubts or question his predetermined future, and Thomas was being asked to be complicit in that suppression. For the first time in his 15-year career, Thomas Mitchell began to seriously consider whether he could continue in a position that required him to act against his own moral compass. 2 months had passed since Thomas's meeting with Commander Richardson, and the relationship between him and Prince George had settled into a careful, professional routine. Their conversations were limited to discussions about schedules, weather, and safe topics like schoolwork and sports. But beneath this forced normalcy, Thomas could sense that George was struggling with something much deeper than teenage growing pains. The young prince had become increasingly isolated, spending most of his car journeys staring out the window in silence. His grades at school remained excellent, and he continued to fulfill his public duties with the same polite professionalism that had always impressed the media and public. But Thomas, who had known George since he was a small child, could see the toll that this suppression was taking on him. It was during a routine trip to a charity event in central London that everything began to unravel. George was scheduled to make a brief appearance at a children's hospital, one of many such events that filled his calendar. These appearances were usually straightforward. Arrive, meet some children, pose for photographs, make a few appropriate comments, and leave. Thomas had escorted him to dozens of similar events over the years. But as they approached the hospital, Thomas noticed that George seemed more agitated than usual. The young prince was fidgeting with his tie, something he only did when he was extremely nervous or upset. His face was pale, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. "Are you feeling all right, sir?" Thomas asked, breaking their usual silence. George looked up, startled. "I'm fine," he said automatically, then paused. "Actually, no, I'm not fine. But I suppose that doesn't matter, does it?" Thomas felt a pang of guilt. He wanted desperately to ask George what was wrong, to offer the same kind of supportive listening that had once been natural between them. But Commander Richardson's warnings echoed in his mind, along with the knowledge that their conversations were likely being monitored more closely now. They arrived at the hospital, where a small crowd of media and hospital staff were waiting. George transformed instantly, switching on the public persona that he had been trained to display since childhood. He smiled, waved, and walked into the building with the confident bearing of someone born to public life. Thomas followed at a discreet distance, maintaining his professional vigilance while watching George interact with the children and hospital staff. Everything proceeded normally for the first hour. George was charming and appropriate, asking the children about their treatments and showing genuine interest in their stories. But then something unexpected happened. A young girl, perhaps 7 years old, asked George a question that stopped him in his tracks. "Prince George," she said in a voice that carried clearly across the room, "do you ever get scared about being a prince? Do you ever wish you could just be a regular kid?" The room fell silent. Hospital staff, media representatives, and other children all turned to look at George, waiting for his response. Thomas watched from across the room as George's carefully maintained composure began to crack. For a long moment, George said nothing. He stared at the little girl with an expression of such raw vulnerability that Thomas felt his own chest tighten with emotion. This was exactly the kind of question that George had been asking himself, and now a 7-year-old had voiced it in front of a room full of people. "Yes," George said quietly, his voice barely audible. "Yes, I do get scared sometimes. And yes, I do wonder what it would be like to be regular." The honesty of his response sent a ripple of shock through the room. This was not the kind of diplomatic non-answer that royal family members were trained to give. This was a genuine, unguarded moment of truth from a 12-year-old boy who had been carrying a burden that was too heavy for his young shoulders. Thomas saw the hospital's media liaison officer step forward, clearly intending to redirect the conversation to safer territory. But before she could intervene, George continued speaking. Sometimes I think about what it would be like to choose my own job, or to go to university and study whatever I wanted, or to travel somewhere just because I wanted to see it, not because it was an official visit. His voice grew stronger as he spoke, as if saying these words aloud was releasing pressure that had been building for months. The little girl nodded solemnly. I wish you could do those things too, she said simply. Thomas watched as tears began to well up in George's eyes. The young prince looked around the room, seeming to suddenly realize that he had just revealed his deepest thoughts to a room full of strangers, including members of the media who would undoubtedly report every word he had said. George began, then stopped. Thomas could see the panic setting in as George realized the magnitude of what had just happened. Without thinking, Thomas stepped forward. Your Royal Highness, he said loudly enough for everyone in the room to hear, we need to leave now. There's been a scheduling change. It was a lie, but it was the only way Thomas could think of to extract George from the situation, before it became even more difficult for him. George looked at Thomas with a mixture of gratitude and desperation, understanding immediately that his protection officer was offering him an escape route. Of course, George said, his voice shaking slightly. I'm sorry we have to cut this short. As they made their way quickly through the hospital corridors toward their car, Thomas could hear the buzz of conversation erupting behind them. He knew that within minutes the story would be spreading through social media and news outlets. George's moment of vulnerability had just become very public. Once they were safely in the car, George collapsed into the back seat, his head in his hands. Oh God, Thomas, he whispered. What have I done? They're going to kill me. Thomas looked in the rearview mirror at the young man who had just exposed his soul to the world, and felt his own resolve crystallizing. You told the truth, he said quietly. You answered a little girl's question honestly. George looked up, his eyes red with unshed tears. But I wasn't supposed to say those things. I'm supposed to say that I'm honored by my role and grateful for the opportunity to serve. I'm not supposed to admit that I question everything about my life. Thomas made a decision that would change both of their lives. He pulled over to the side of the road and turned around to face George directly. George, he said, using the prince's name without any formal title. What you said in there was brave and honest. Don't let anyone make you feel ashamed of that. George stared at Thomas in surprise. They both knew that this conversation was exactly the kind of interaction that Thomas had been ordered to avoid. But what happens now? George asked. The story will be everywhere by tonight. My father is going to be furious. The palace is going to have to do damage. Control. Thomas saw something in George's eyes that made his heart break. It was the look of a young man who was more concerned about disappointing others than he was about his own well-being. What happens now? Thomas said carefully, is that you get to decide who you want to be, not just as a prince but as a person. And if the people around you can't handle your honesty, then maybe the problem isn't with you. George stared at Thomas for a long moment, and something passed between them, an understanding that they were both approaching a point of no return. Thank you, George said simply, for getting me out of there, and for saying that. As Thomas started the car and resumed their journey back to the palace, both of them knew that everything was about to change. George's public moment of vulnerability would force conversations that the royal family had been avoiding, and Thomas would have to decide whether he could continue protecting someone while being complicit in a system that was causing that person obvious pain. The media storm that followed George's hospital visit was unlike anything Thomas had witnessed in his 15 years of royal protection duty. Within hours of leaving the children's hospital, news outlets across the globe were running stories with headlines like, Prince George's shocking, admission and future king questions royal. Social media exploded with debates about the young prince's comments, with some praising his honesty, while others criticized what they saw as ingratitude toward his privileged position. Thomas spent the evening monitoring the coverage from his small flat in Windsor, his stomach churning as he watched endless replays of George's vulnerable moment being dissected by news anchors and royal commentators. The little girl's innocent question and George's heartfelt response had been turned into a sensation that was being analyzed from every possible angle. His phone buzzed, constantly throughout the night with calls from colleagues, friends, and even reporters who had somehow gotten hold of his number. Thomas ignored them all, knowing that anything he said would only make the situation worse for George. The next morning, Thomas arrived at Kensington Palace to find the building buzzing with activity. Staff members moved through the corridors with the urgent efficiency of people in crisis management mode. As he made his way to the security office, Thomas overheard fragments of conversations about damage control and media statements and reassurances about commitment to duty. Commander Richardson was waiting for him with a grim expression. "Thomas, we need to talk immediately." Her office felt even more sterile than usual, and Thomas noticed that there were additional security monitors active, suggesting that the entire palace was on heightened alert. "I assume you've seen the coverage," Sarah said without preamble. "Yes, ma'am." "Then you understand the magnitude of the situation we're dealing with. Prince George's comments yesterday have created a crisis that requires immediate and decisive action." Thomas remained silent, waiting for her to continue. "The family is meeting this morning to discuss how to handle this situation. There will likely be a public statement clarifying Prince George's remarks and reaffirming his commitment to his royal duties. But that's not why I called you here." Sarah leaned forward, her expression grave. "Thomas, I need to know exactly what happened in that hospital room. I need to know if there was any way this situation could have been prevented." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. "I'm not sure what you mean, ma'am." "I mean that Prince George's outburst didn't happen in a vacuum. For months now, we've been aware that he's been expressing doubts about his role. We specifically discussed your responsibility to redirect those conversations and report any concerning developments." Thomas realized where this conversation was heading. "Are you suggesting that I'm somehow responsible for what happened yesterday?" "I'm suggesting that if you had properly followed protocols, Prince George might not have felt so comfortable expressing those thoughts publicly. A child doesn't spontaneously question their entire life purpose unless those questions have been validated somewhere else." The accusation hung between them like a toxic cloud. Thomas felt his anger rising, but he worked to keep his voice steady. "Prince George is a thoughtful, intelligent young man who has been asking difficult questions about his future since he was old enough to understand what that future holds. My conversations with him have always been supportive and appropriate." Sarah's expression hardened. "That's where we disagree, Thomas. Your role is not to be supportive of doubts or questions that undermine the stability of the monarchy. Your role is to protect the prince, which includes protecting him from his own momentary weaknesses." Thomas stared at her, trying to process what he was hearing. "Are you seriously suggesting that I should have taught a 12-year-old boy to suppress his honest feelings and questions about his own life? I'm suggesting that you should have guided him toward understanding the honor and importance of his role, rather than encouraging him to view it as a burden." Thomas felt something snap inside him. "I never encouraged him to view anything as a burden. I simply treated him like a human being with valid thoughts and feelings." Sarah stood up from her desk, signaling that the conversation was coming to an end. "Thomas, effective immediately, you are being reassigned. You will no longer be serving as Prince George's primary protection officer." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. Despite everything that had been building toward this moment, he hadn't been prepared for the finality of it. "Ma'am, with respect, my relationship with Prince George is built on trust and mutual respect. Removing me from his detail now when he's dealing with this media crisis could be harmful to his well-being." Sarah's expression remained unmoved. "The decision has been made at the highest levels, Thomas. Your replacement will begin tomorrow. Today will be your last day with Prince George." Thomas left the security office feeling like his world had been turned upside down. He had one final car journey with George, one last opportunity to provide support to a young man who was facing unprecedented scrutiny and pressure. When George emerged from the palace for their trip to school that morning, Thomas could immediately see the toll that the past 24 hours had taken on him. The prince's face was pale and drawn, and he moved with the careful, measured steps of someone trying to maintain control while everything around him was falling apart. George climbed into the car without his usual greeting, and they drove in silence for several minutes. Finally, George spoke. "I suppose you've heard about the meetings this morning, about the statement they're going to release on my behalf." Thomas glanced in the rearview mirror. "I know there's been a lot of discussion about how to handle the situation." George laughed bitterly. "They're going to say that I was overwhelmed by meeting sick children, and that my comments were taken out of context. They're going to say that I remain fully committed to my royal duties, and that I look forward to serving the country as future king." Thomas felt his heart break for the young man. "And how do you feel about that statement?" George met his eyes in the mirror. "I feel like they're asking me to lie, to pretend that I didn't mean what I said, even though everyone who heard me knows that I was being completely honest." They drove in silence for another few minutes before George spoke again. "Thomas, I know this is probably going to be our last journey together." Thomas's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "What makes you say that?" "Because I know how these things work. When someone in my position causes problems, the people around them get reassigned or dismissed. It's easier than actually addressing the underlying issues." Thomas pulled the car over to the side of the road one final time, knowing that this would be their last private conversation. When he turned to face George, he saw not a future king, but a lonely, confused young man who needed someone to validate his feelings. "George," Thomas said, "I want you to remember something. What you said yesterday was brave and honest. Don't let anyone convince you that your feelings don't matter, or that your questions aren't valid." George's eyes filled with tears. "But what if they're right? What if I am being selfish and ungrateful?" Thomas leaned forward, speaking with more intensity than he had ever used with the prince. "You are a human being first and a prince second. You have the right to question your future, to feel uncertainty, to want things for yourself. Don't let anyone take that away from you." George wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "Thank you, Thomas, for everything. For treating me like a real person instead of just a title." As they completed their final journey together, both Thomas and George understood that they had reached the end of more than just a professional relationship. They had reached the end of a period in George's life when he had someone who encouraged him to be honest about his feelings and questions. Thomas realized that his removal from George's security detail was not just about protecting the monarchy. From his influence, it was about isolating the young prince from anyone who might validate his doubts or encourage his independence. And that realization made Thomas's next decision inevitable. Thomas spent his first week away from Prince George's security detail assigned to general palace duty, a role that felt both demeaning and heartbreaking after 15 years of specialized protection work. He found himself monitoring entrance gates, checking credentials of visitors, and performing routine security sweeps of empty rooms. The work was mind-numbing, but it gave him too much time to think about George and worry about how the young prince was coping with everything that had happened. From conversations with other staff members, Thomas learned that the official palace statement had been released exactly as George had predicted. It carefully dismissed his hospital comments as the result of being emotionally affected by meeting brave children facing serious illnesses, and reaffirmed his deep commitment to his future role in service to the country. The statement had been professionally crafted to minimize damage while providing no acknowledgement of the underlying issues that had prompted George's honest moment. Thomas also heard whispers that George had become even more withdrawn since the incident. His new protection officer, a stern man named Detective Inspector Harrison, reported that the prince barely spoke during their journeys and seemed to be going through the motions of his daily routine without any real engagement. It was during his second week of general duty that Thomas encountered something that would solidify his decision about his future with the Royal Protection Service. He was conducting a routine security check in one of the palace's administrative wings when he overheard a conversation that stopped him in his tracks. Through a partially open door, Thomas could hear Commander Richardson speaking with someone he recognized as Dr. Margaret Thornfield, a child psychologist who occasionally consulted with the royal family on matters concerning the younger members. "The important thing," Commander Richardson was saying, "is that we prevent any recurrence of the kind of outburst we saw at the hospital. Prince George needs to understand that his personal feelings are secondary to his public duties." Dr. Thornfield's voice carried a note of concern. "Commander, I have to say that from what I've observed, Prince George is showing signs of significant emotional distress. His willingness to speak so openly about his doubts suggests that he's been struggling with these feelings for some time, which is exactly why we need to ensure he has proper guidance," Richardson replied firmly. "Guidance that reinforces his sense of duty rather than encouraging his self-indulgent questioning." Thomas found himself leaning closer to the door, horrified by what he was hearing. I'm concerned about the psychological impact of suppressing these natural developmental questions, Dr. Thornfield continued. Adolescents need the opportunity to explore their identity and consider their future options. Forcing them to accept predetermined roles without question can lead to serious mental health issues. Richardson's voice became colder. Dr. Thornfield, Prince George is not an ordinary adolescent. He was born into extraordinary circumstances that require extraordinary discipline. Our job is to help him understand and accept those circumstances, not to validate doubts that could destabilize the monarchy. But at what cost to the child himself? Dr. Thornfield asked. We're talking about a 12-year-old boy who is clearly struggling with anxiety and depression related to his future role. Ignoring his emotional needs in favor of institutional stability could have devastating long-term consequences. There was a pause before Richardson responded. The needs of the institution must take priority. Prince George will learn to adapt, as generations of royals have done before him. What he needs now is structure, discipline, and people around him who reinforce his sense of duty, rather than encouraging his weakness. Thomas heard the sound of chairs moving and realized the meeting was ending. He quickly moved away from the door, his mind reeling from what he had just overheard. The conversation had confirmed his worst fears about how George was being treated in the aftermath of his honest moment at the hospital. That evening, Thomas sat in his flat staring at a resignation letter he had begun writing but couldn't bring himself to finish. He had devoted 15 years of his life to Royal Protection Service, and walking away would mean giving up not only his career, but also his pension and his sense of professional identity. But the conversation he had overheard made it clear that staying would mean being complicit in what he increasingly saw as the systematic suppression of a vulnerable young person. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but when he answered, he was surprised to hear Prince William's voice. Thomas, I hope you don't mind me calling you directly. I got your number from the personnel files. Thomas felt his pulse quicken. Not at all, sir. How can I help you? There was a pause before Prince William continued. I wanted to speak with you about George. I know you've been reassigned, but I also know that you developed a close working relationship with my son over the years. Yes, sir. Prince George is a remarkable young man. He is, Prince William agreed. And that's why I'm calling. Thomas, George has been struggling since the hospital incident. He's withdrawn, he's not sleeping well, and he seems to have lost the spark that has always defined him. His new protection officer reports that he barely speaks during their journeys together. Thomas chose his words carefully. I'm sorry to hear that, sir. The media attention and the pressure to walk back his comments must be very difficult for him. Prince William sighed deeply. That's just it, Thomas. I don't think we handled this situation correctly. I've been reflecting on what George said at the hospital, and I realized that we immediately went into crisis management mode without actually listening to what he was trying to tell us. Thomas felt a glimmer of hope. What do you mean, sir? I mean that maybe my son was trying to share something important with us, and instead of hearing him, we focused on damage control and public relations. We forced him to accept a statement that essentially denied his true feelings. Thomas remained silent, not sure how much he should reveal about his own thoughts on the situation. Prince William continued. Thomas, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. In your conversations with George, did he express genuine concerns about his future role? Or was this something that developed suddenly? Thomas took a deep breath, realizing that this might be his only opportunity to advocate for George. Sir, Prince George has been asking thoughtful questions about his future for months. He's a bright, sensitive young man who naturally wonders about having choices in his life. His comments at the hospital weren't sudden or impulsive. They were the expression of feelings he's been carrying for a long time. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, Prince William spoke again. I was afraid you were going to say that. Thomas, I need to ask you one more question. Do you think we're handling this correctly? Do you think the way we're approaching George's concerns is in his best interest? Thomas realized that this was a moment that would define not only his own future, but potentially George's as well. He could give the diplomatic answer that would protect his position and avoid controversy, or he could tell the truth that might actually help the young man he had come to care about deeply. Sir, with all due respect, I think Prince George needs someone to listen to his concerns without immediately trying to fix or suppress them. He needs to know that his feelings are valid, and that questioning his future doesn't make him weak or ungrateful. Most importantly, he needs to maintain some sense of agency in his own life, even within the constraints of his royal duties. Prince William was quiet for several moments. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "Thank you for being honest with me, Thomas. I have a lot to think about." After the call ended, Thomas sat staring at his half-written resignation letter with new uncertainty. Perhaps there was still hope that someone in the royal family was willing to listen to George's concerns and consider his emotional well-being, alongside the needs of the institution. But even as he felt this glimmer of optimism, Thomas knew that the fundamental problem remained unchanged. The royal establishment had made it clear that they viewed George's honesty and questions as problems to be managed, rather than natural expressions of a developing young mind. And Thomas had to decide whether he could continue to be part of a system that prioritized institutional stability over the well-being of the child he had been sworn to protect. 3 days after his phone conversation with Prince William, Thomas was summoned to an unexpected meeting. Instead of reporting to Commander Richardson's office, he was directed to a private sitting room in Kensington Palace that he had never entered before. When he arrived, he found Prince William waiting alone, dressed casually in jeans and a sweater rather than his usual formal attire. "Thomas, thank you for coming," Prince William said, gesturing for him to take a seat. "I asked to meet with you privately because I've been doing a lot of thinking since our phone conversation." Thomas settled into the comfortable chair, uncertain about what to expect from this unprecedented meeting. Prince William continued, "I've spent the past few days talking with Catherine about George, about his comments at the hospital, and about how we've been handling this situation. We've also had several conversations with George himself, real conversations, not the formal debriefings he's been receiving from palace staff." Thomas remained silent, sensing that Prince William needed to work through his thoughts aloud. "What we discovered is that our son has been carrying a tremendous burden of doubt and anxiety for months, possibly longer. He's been questioning not just his future role, but his right to have questions at all. He told us that he felt guilty for not being grateful enough, ashamed for wanting things that other children take for granted." Thomas felt his heart ache for George, imagining the young man struggling with these feelings alone. Prince William stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the palace gardens. "Thomas, George also told us about his conversations with you. He said that you were the only person who made him feel like his questions were normal and valid. He said you treated him like a human being rather than just a future king." Thomas wasn't sure how to respond. "I simply tried to be honest with him, sir." Prince William turned back to face Thomas. "And that's exactly what he needed, what we all failed to provide." He paused, then continued with visible emotion. "My son has been drowning, Thomas, and instead of throwing him a lifeline, we've been pushing his head underwater in the name of duty and tradition." The raw honesty of Prince William's words surprised Thomas. This was not the composed, diplomatic prince he had always known, but a father grappling with the realization that he had failed his child. "Catherine and I have made some decisions," Prince William continued. "First, we're going to be taking George out of the public eye for several months. No official engagements, no media appearances. He needs time to be a 12-year-old boy without the weight of public expectation." Thomas felt a surge of relief. "I think that's wise, sir. Second, we're going to be making some changes to how George is supported and protected. The current approach clearly isn't working for him." Prince William returned to his seat, leaning forward intently. "Thomas, I want to offer you the opportunity to return to George's protection detail, but with a different understanding of your role." Thomas felt his pulse quicken. "What kind of different understanding, sir?" "I want you to continue being the person who listens to George without judgment, who validates his concerns, who treats him as a whole person rather than just a royal duty. I've realized that protection doesn't just mean keeping him safe from external threats. It also means protecting his emotional well-being and his right to be heard." Thomas stared at Prince William, hardly believing what he was hearing. "Sir, Commander Richardson was very clear about the protocols regarding personal conversations with Prince George." Prince William's expression hardened slightly. "Thomas, I am Prince George's father, and I outrank Commander Richardson. I'm telling you that your previous approach was exactly what my son needed, and I want you to continue providing that kind of support." Thomas felt a weight lifting from his shoulders, that he hadn't even realized he was carrying. "I would be honored to return to Prince George's protection detail, sir." "There's something else," Prince William said. "Catherine and I have decided that when George is ready, we want to have honest conversations with him about his future. Not conversations aimed at convincing him to accept his role without question, but genuine discussions about what his life might look like and what choices might be available to him." Thomas felt amazed by this development. "That sounds like exactly what he needs, sir." Prince William stood up again, this time with a sense of resolution. "Thomas, I need you to understand something. What I'm asking you to do goes against years of royal protocol and tradition. There will be people within the palace establishment who disagree with this approach. You may face pressure to return to the old way of handling things." Thomas considered this carefully. "And if that pressure comes, then you come to me directly. I'm making it clear to everyone involved that Prince George's emotional well-being is our top priority, and that includes ensuring he has people around him who support his right to express his thoughts and feelings." As Thomas prepared to leave the meeting, Prince William stopped him with one final request. "Thomas, there's one more thing I need to ask of you. This conversation and the new approach we're taking with George needs to remain confidential for now. We need time to implement these changes without external pressure or media speculation." Thomas nodded. "Of course, sir. Thank you. And Thomas, George doesn't know yet that you're returning to his detail. I'd like that to be a surprise." The next morning, Thomas arrived at Kensington Palace with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in weeks. Instead of reporting for general duty, he made his way to the familiar garage where Prince George's car was kept. As he prepared the vehicle for the journey to Lambrook School, Thomas felt like he was returning home after a long, difficult journey. When George emerged from the palace building, Thomas watched as the young prince's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, confusion, and finally unmistakable joy. "Thomas," George said, approaching the car tentatively, "I thought you weren't my protection officer anymore." Thomas opened the car door with a smile. "Apparently I've been reinstated, Your Royal Highness." George climbed into the car and Thomas could see him trying to contain his excitement. As they drove through the familiar London streets, George finally spoke. "Thomas, does this mean things are going back to the way they were? Can we actually talk to each other again?" Thomas glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the hope in George's eyes. "It means we can talk about whatever you want to talk about, whenever you want to talk about it. No restrictions, no protocols. Just honest conversation between two people who care about each other." George was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "I've missed you, Thomas. Really missed you." "I've missed you too, George. More than you know." As they continued their journey, Thomas realized that Prince William's decision represented more than just a change in George's protection detail. It represented a fundamental shift in how the royal family was choosing to approach the challenge of raising a child who would one day be king. For the first time in months, Thomas felt hopeful about George's future, not because the challenges had disappeared, but because the young prince would now have the support he needed to navigate those challenges authentically. George would still have to find his way through the complex demands of royal life, but he would no longer have to do it alone or in silence. Thomas understood that his resignation letter would never be finished. His place was here, protecting and supporting a remarkable young man who deserved to have his voice heard and his feelings validated. In choosing to prioritize George's well-being over institutional tradition, Prince William had given both his son and Thomas the gift of hope. The road ahead would not be easy, but for the first time since that conversation in the car months ago, Thomas believed that George would have the chance to find his own way forward, with honesty, support, and the knowledge that his questions and concerns were not weaknesses to be suppressed, but signs of the thoughtful, caring person he was becoming.